Anne Askew was burned alive for reading the Bible. She was a daughter of gentry, born to a world where obedience was expected and silence was survival. But Anne Askew's mind was never silent. In a Tudor England where the act of reading the Bible in your own language could condemn you, Anne craved forbidden knowledge. She moved through stone corridors, through the long shadows of a palace built on secrets, with the courage to question what the world told her was sacred and unbreakable. Her defiance did not begin with violence or banners, but with the simple, world-altering act of opening a book. She read the English Bible, not as a crime, but as a right. Her right to find God without a priest as her warden. She copied verses by candlelight, sharing fragments of scripture and coded messages with other women, other dreamers. In the quiet, Anne sowed a kind of sedition more dangerous than any sword, a new idea that the soul could speak directly to the divine. It was 1546. Henry VIII's England had torn itself apart over faith. The king's new church was not truly Protestant nor safely Catholic. Heresy was a shadow in every room, lurking in the language of sermons, the margins of prayer books, the whispered suspicions of neighbors. Anne's husband did not support her radical hunger for Scripture. She was eventually thrown out, forced to survive by her wits and her belief that truth mattered more than safety. But Anne did not hide. She walked the streets of London, distributing banned Protestant pamphlets, meeting secretly with the persecuted. Her courage made her a target. Someone betrayed her, as always happens, in regimes built on fear. The authorities descended, hungry for an example. Anne was arrested and interrogated at Sadler's Hall, her mind sharp even as the room filled with threats. They wanted names. They wanted to break her resolve and reveal a secret network of women, wives of powerful men, who read, questioned, and doubted. Anne refused. She debated learned bishops to their faces, confounding them with her knowledge of Scripture. Each answer was a paradox, a gentle voice undermining centuries of hierarchy with a single word. Her responses were so precise, so unwavering, that the men around her grew frustrated, then frightened. Anne was transferred to the Tower of London. Here, fear was a weapon. Here, the rack waited. She was not supposed to survive what came next. The rack is not just a device of pain, but of annihilation, stretching flesh until it breaks, dislocating the body from itself, an attempt to force the soul to confess anything, just to end the agony. But Anne Askew did not yield. As her bones shattered and her joints tore apart, she held fast to her faith and her silence. They wanted her to betray her friends. They wanted her to name noble women who shared her beliefs. Anne gave them nothing. Torturers had rarely witnessed such defiance from anyone, let alone a young woman whose body was failing, but whose eyes burned with the certainty of someone who believed in something larger than herself. Anne was left so broken she could not walk. On the day of her execution, she was carried to the stake in a chair. Her enemies thought the pain would silence her, but it only honed her voice. The burning was staged at Smithfield, a public theater of terror meant to teach obedience through spectacle. Anne's body was already ruined, but her spirit was unbreakable. She refused the offer of a pardon if she recanted her beliefs. Even as the crowd gathered, some with curiosity, some with dread, Anne prayed aloud, her words clear, echoing across the square and through the corridors of power. She forgave her enemies. She refused the painkillers offered by the authorities, rejecting the last mercy from those who would destroy her. The flames climbed her dress, her skin, the wreckage of her body. But to those who witnessed it, it seemed as if Anne Askew was consumed not by fire, but by conviction. In her final moments, she became more than a rebel. She became a myth, a warning, and an inspiration. The authorities tried to erase her name, to bury her words, but Anne's story spread in secret pamphlets and whispered tales. Her trial transcript, smuggled out by supporters, became a rallying cry for English Protestants, proof that faith could not be killed by fire, nor truth drowned out by screams. In death, she became a mirror for a fractured England, a country at war with itself, haunted by the ghosts of martyrs, each burning exposing the rot at the heart of power. Anne's legacy is not just religious. She stands as one of the earliest English women to write her own narrative, to argue, to debate, to challenge men who thought her voice meant nothing. Her story is a warning. Every time the powerful fear a question, every time they try to erase a dissenting voice, they create a martyr. Her ashes became the seed of 1,000 new rebels, each willing to risk everything for the right to read, to think, to question. Centuries later, her voice remains. It can be found in the lines of every banned book, every forbidden thought, every person who chooses to risk comfort for the hope of a truth worth burning for. Anne Askew was not just executed for reading the Bible. She was executed for daring to imagine a world where women could speak, could doubt, could reach for the divine without permission. Her death was supposed to end a movement. Instead, it proved that sometimes all it takes to change history is for one person to choose the flame over silence. Lady Jane Grey was queen for 9 days. Then executed. They called her the 9 Days Queen, but Jane Grey never wanted to be queen at all. She was 16, clever, fiercely intelligent, with eyes that seemed to search for answers history had already decided to withhold from her. Jane was born into the chaos of Tudor ambition, a pawn on a board where everyone else was older, hungrier, and far more dangerous. Imagine her, a girl fluent in Greek, Latin, and the theology of conscience, surrounded by men who whispered prayers with one hand and drew daggers with the other. England in the summer of 1553 was not a place for innocence. King Edward VI, the pale, sickly boy-king, was dying, consumed by tuberculosis, surrounded by ministers who plotted succession not for the nation, but for their own survival. Edward, manipulated by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, sought to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from taking the throne. So he signed a device for succession, skipping over Mary and Elizabeth to put Jane, his Protestant cousin, a teenager, next in line. Jane's own parents were complicit. Her father, Henry Grey, and her mother, Frances, raised her in a house where affection was rationed. But discipline and ambition were never in short supply. Jane's only escape was her learning, her books, the quiet certainty that truth could still be found somewhere in Scripture. But even truth was a weapon now. Jane was married off to Guilford Dudley, Northumberland's son, a wedding that tasted like a political treaty. She wept, but no one heard her. The plan, as it unfolded, was swift and merciless. When Edward died in July, Jane was hustled to the Tower of London. There, in a ceremony cold as marble, she was declared queen. She fainted when the crown was presented to her. Outside the tower, the city murmured. The people did not love Jane, but neither did they hate her. She was a stranger, a name without a face, and the real England lay silent, waiting to see who would bleed. Mary Tudor, Edward's elder sister, did not wait. She rode to East Anglia, gathered supporters, and issued her claim. The country shifted in a single tidal movement. Nobles defected, soldiers switched sides, and the dream of Jane's reign evaporated like mist. Jane's father, sensing doom, fled, leaving his daughter and wife behind. The Tower became her prison. She spent her days reading the Bible, praying, writing letters to her sisters, words that trembled with hope, faith, and fear. When Mary's forces entered London, Jane was deposed. The girl who never asked for a throne was now charged with treason. Her mother pleaded for her life. Even Mary hesitated. She was not yet Bloody Mary. For a moment, mercy seemed possible. Jane, if she would just convert to Catholicism, might be spared. But Jane refused. Her faith, the very reason she was chosen as queen, became the reason she would die. The political situation darkened. A rebellion broke out, led by Thomas Wyatt. Jane's father joined the uprising, and the fragile hope of her survival snapped. Mary had to make an example. In February 1554, Jane was sentenced to death. She met her fate with a composure beyond her years. The morning of her execution, she was led from her cell to Tower Green, her young husband already dead. The crowd was silent, the sky iron gray. Jane carried a prayer book, recited Psalm 51, and forgave her executioner. She knelt, blindfolded, struggled to find the block, and spoke her final words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell. Her blood joined the long, silent river that runs beneath English history, the price paid for other people's ambition. Jane Grey, who wanted nothing but to read, to think, to be left alone, became a martyr to power she never wielded. But her story does not end at the scaffold. For centuries her ghost has haunted England. She is remembered as the girl sacrificed for politics, the lost queen whose reign lasted only 9 days, the innocent whose only crime was being too close to a throne everyone else was willing to kill for. Her life is a warning that power corrupts not just the ones who seek it, but sometimes the ones who have it thrust upon them. Jane's tragedy is more than the tragedy of youth and innocence betrayed. It is the tragedy of a world that chews up the gentle, the wise, and the unwilling, leaving their stories behind like scattered petals on a blood-stained crown. Elizabeth Barton, the nun who predicted the king's death. Imagine England in the early 1500s, a land burning with anxiety, faith, and fear. The monarch is Henry VIII, and every whisper in the market or shadow in a chapel holds the weight of political danger. Across villages and cathedral towns, the church bells toll out their routines, but behind those bells, something else is happening. A slow tremor of unrest, carried on the lips of a young woman barely out of girlhood. Her name is Elizabeth Barton, a simple servant girl transformed by sickness into a visionary and then into a weapon against a king. Elizabeth's story begins not in splendor, but in pain. As a teenager in Kent, she falls desperately ill, racked by convulsions and mysterious seizures that leave her neighbors both terrified and enthralled. But out of her agony, Barton begins to speak. Not with her own voice, she claims, but with the voice of heaven. She describes visions of the Virgin Mary, the torments of the damned, and urgent warnings for the sinful. The villagers gather in awe. Rumors begin to spread that this frail servant girl is a chosen mouthpiece of God. At first, the visions are simple, almost childlike, cries for repentance, prayers for mercy, warnings against blasphemy and pride. But England is changing. The very fabric of the church is under assault as Henry VIII grows desperate to divorce his queen, Katherine of Aragon, in pursuit of a new wife and, above all, a male heir. The Pope's refusal lights a match under a tinderbox of ancient loyalties. The nation divides. On one side, Henry and his courtiers, on the other, the stubborn defenders of Catholic tradition. In this climate, Elizabeth Barton's fame spreads like wildfire. Pilgrims travel miles to hear her prophecies and to witness her in ecstatic trance, speaking in tongues and denouncing wickedness. Clergy and nobles alike begin to listen. She becomes a nun, cloistered at St. Sepulchre's in Canterbury, but even behind those walls her visions sharpen, growing ever more political. She claims, with terrible conviction, that Henry's divorce is not merely sinful, but doomed. If the king defies Rome and marries Anne Boleyn, she warns, he will die a shameful death and be cast into hell. Her words are spoken with such ferocity and such apparent certainty that even the mighty begin to tremble. The country is mesmerized. Her prophecies ripple through court and countryside alike, passed from hand to hand, written down, repeated, and embroidered in the retelling. Some treat her as a living saint, others as a dangerous fanatic. To many, she is the last desperate hope that God might yet intervene and save England from heresy and schism. But in the palaces of power, Barton's fame is a poison. Henry's advisers, especially Thomas Cromwell, know that words can be deadlier than any sword. The Maid of Kent, with her crowds and her holy rage, is not just a spiritual threat. She is a political one. Cromwell's spies watch her every move. Letters are intercepted, sermons are scrutinized. The king, already angry and cornered by Rome, cannot risk his fragile new order being undermined by a peasant nun with the ear of the people. And so the machinery of repression begins to grind. Barton is summoned to London. She is questioned, then interrogated, then finally broken. The details are lost to time, but the pressure must have been unbearable. Threats, isolation, perhaps even the promise of mercy, if she confesses. She is forced to recant her visions publicly at St. Paul's Cross, where she stands pale and trembling before a crowd who once worshipped her. She calls herself a liar, a deceiver, a tool of the devil. But few believe this broken version. To the faithful, she is a martyr already. It isn't enough. Cromwell and Henry need an example, a warning to any who would challenge royal supremacy. Barton, along with several of her supporters, monks, priests, even a former confessor, are condemned as traitors. The charge is treason, for to speak against the king's marriage is, in this New England, to challenge the very foundation of law. The sentence is hanging at Tyburn, the infamous execution ground outside London. On April 20th, 1534, Elizabeth Barton is dragged through the muddy streets on a hurdle, a common criminal among her fellow condemned. The crowds that once knelt in prayer for her now watch in grim silence as she is hanged, her body left on display as a symbol of royal power and of the price of prophecy. Even in death, Barton's influence lingers. Her execution sends shockwaves through England. Some whisper that miracles occur at her grave, others curse her as a madwoman. But the lesson is clear. Under Henry VIII, there is no voice safe from the axe, no vision immune to the machinery of state. The story of Elizabeth Barton is more than a tragedy. It is a portrait of an age when belief itself was dangerous, when the word of a poor nun could terrify a king and threaten the fate of a nation. She was both victim and symbol, a vessel for the hopes and fears of thousands. In the end, her life became a warning etched in blood and silence. In a world ruled by power and faith, the cost of speaking the truth, or simply what others believe to be truth, can be everything. And yet, centuries later, Barton's name endures, not as a queen or conqueror, but as a voice that would not be quieted, no matter how brutally silenced. The echoes of her visions remind us that history is written not just by those who wield power, but also by those brave or doomed enough to stand in its path and speak what they see, even when the darkness closes in. Margaret Pole was chopped to death without a trial. In the shadowed corridors of Tudor England, where bloodlines were both blessing and curse, there lived a woman whose name echoed with old royal power, a name that haunted the new king like a half-forgotten nightmare. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was not just any noblewoman. She was the last of the Plantagenets, a living link to a dynasty erased in civil war, a silent reminder that the Tudors did not own England by birthright, but by violence and luck. She was 67 years old when death came hunting her, and by then she had survived more than most women of her age, her line stalked and slaughtered for 100 years. But in Henry VIII's England, the past was never allowed to sleep, and every shadow hid a threat to the throne. Margaret was born into power, daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Edward IV and Richard III, kings of England. Her childhood was marked by the sharp, sudden turns of fate that made the Wars of the Roses so infamous. She lost her father to an executioner's blade before she was 5, her mother to political obscurity. Margaret's Plantagenet blood, so precious in one decade, became poison in the next. When Henry VII seized the crown at Bosworth, he knew the Plantagenet heirs could never be truly safe or free. Margaret was kept close, half guest, half prisoner, always watched. For a time the world forgot her. She married, bore children, lived in quiet loyalty. Her son, Reginald Pole, would become one of the great Catholic scholars of Europe, a future cardinal, a thorn in Henry VIII's side. Margaret herself gained the favor of Henry VIII early in his reign. He restored her family lands, granted her the earldom of Salisbury in her own right, and she served as governess to Princess Mary, Henry's beloved daughter by Katherine of Aragon. But royal favor is only sunlight before the storm. The tides of history would soon turn, and old blood would once again demand payment. The break with Rome changed everything. When Henry VIII declared himself head of the Church of England and dissolved his marriage to Katherine, he created enemies everywhere, none more dangerous than those with royal blood and Catholic loyalty. Reginald Pole, Margaret's son, openly opposed Henry's religious revolution from Rome. His writings condemned the king as a heretic and a tyrant, calling for his overthrow. For Henry, this was treason. The son's rebellion painted a target on the mother's back. Margaret became suspect by association, a relic of the old order, too noble, too connected, and now too close to open rebellion. Yet there was no evidence against her, no plot, no secret conspiracy. Her crime was existing. Her existence was an insult to the new world being forged. In 1538, Henry's agents acted. Margaret was arrested and taken to the grim fortress of the Tower of London. She was interrogated, pressed for secrets she did not have. She denied every accusation, maintained her innocence, wrote letters begging for justice. But justice in Henry's court was a mask for vengeance. There would be no trial. There would be no mercy. For 2 years Margaret languished in the Tower, her health failing, her family destroyed. Her grandson was executed, her son hunted in exile. She was stripped of her titles, her property, her dignity. But she never confessed, never pleaded for forgiveness she did not owe. She was a symbol now, a warning to all who might remember the old royal blood or dare challenge Henry's power. Then, on the morning of May 27, 1541, the order came. The Countess was to die. No trial, no hearing, just a command from the king. It was said that Margaret, frail and aged, was bewildered when told her fate. She was led out to the Tower Green, where executions for the nobility were held, out of public view, but not out of living memory. The official executioner was absent, so a clumsy, inexperienced substitute was brought in. What happened next would stain the ground and echo in whispered stories for centuries. Margaret Pole did not kneel willingly. Some say she refused, declaring, "I am no traitor." The executioner, nervous and unskilled, brought down his axe but missed the mark. The blade struck her shoulder, tearing flesh but sparing her life. She tried to flee, pursued across the scaffold as blow after blow fell. It took at least 11 strikes before she finally fell silent. The witnesses, soldiers, servants, even rival nobles, were horrified by the spectacle. It was not just an execution, but a butchery, an act so brutal that even Henry's most loyal men flinched. Yet the message was clear. No bloodline, no history, no royal birth could protect you from the king's paranoia. Margaret Pole's death was meant to erase her line from the earth, to destroy the memory of a family that had once ruled England and now haunted the Tudors with their claims. But the cruelty of her end did the opposite. It turned Margaret into a martyr, a symbol of innocence destroyed by tyranny, of dignity in the face of monstrous power. In the years that followed, Reginald Pole would mourn his mother from afar. He would never return to England while Henry lived. The Tudor regime would use Margaret's lands and legacy to reward its favorites. But her story refused to die. The old families remembered her, the Countess who stood alone against a king and refused to kneel. Even Protestant writers, centuries later, would speak of the horror of her end. The tale of Margaret Pole would become a dark mirror for the violence at the heart of Tudor rule, a warning that no one is truly safe when the throne is built on fear. Margaret's death closed the door on a chapter of English history. She was the last legitimate Plantagenet. Her blood, her story, her stubborn courage marked the true end of that dynasty. But she also exposed the rot within the new order. Her execution revealed the lengths to which Henry would go to silence the past, and how even the innocent could be branded traitors in the name of royal security. She showed that history is written not just by the victors, but by the victims whose suffering lingers in the silence after the axe falls. Today, the stones of the tower hold the memory of Margaret Pole, a memory that refuses to fade, a shadow that reminds us how power, unchecked, always finds a new victim. Her life was shaped by loyalty, survival, and loss, but her death was shaped by fear. Fear of the past, fear of blood, fear that the truth can never be completely buried. In the end, the king who tried to erase her only ensured she would be remembered. And so, centuries later, the story of Margaret Pole, daughter, mother, countess, victim, remains sharp and unbroken, like a blade that history could not dull. Katherine Howard was executed for teenage mistakes. She was just a teenager when her world became a chessboard of power, betrayal, and fear. Katherine Howard was no villain, just a young girl caught in the gears of a merciless machine, a machine named Henry VIII, whose throne had already devoured wives and enemies alike. To tell her story is to drag into the light the darkest corners of Tudor England, where innocence could be twisted into a crime and where youth was no protection from the axe. Katherine Howard grew up in the shadowy, chaotic world of English nobility. Born around 1523, she was thrust as a child into the orbit of the Duke of Norfolk, her powerful uncle, and quickly became one of many neglected young women in the care of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Her childhood was not gentle. It was noisy, crowded, and barely supervised, a breeding ground for adolescent mistakes. Katherine was spirited, naive, and desperate for attention, the perfect target for older, predatory men. In those years, she formed innocent yet reckless bonds, letters, whispered secrets, stolen moments with men who saw her not as a person, but as an opportunity. These private, foolish missteps would become her death warrant. But for a moment her fortunes changed. She was plucked from obscurity and placed in the glittering court of Henry VIII. The king, bloated by power and disappointment, had already cast off or destroyed 4 wives. He was nearly 30 years her senior, and Katherine, barely more than a girl, became his queen. The court rejoiced, calling her the Rose Without a Thorn, her beauty and energy a balm for Henry's wounded pride. But beneath the jewels and silks, Katherine was terrified. She played the part, smiling, dancing, pretending to adore the monstrous, unpredictable king, because she had no choice. Every move, every word, was watched and judged. In a palace built on secrets, she could trust no one. Even her closest companions were future witnesses, and every gesture could become evidence. Rumors began to swirl, whispers of Katherine's past, of old love letters, of men who had once called her darling. Her enemies, jealous courtiers, rival factions, and the king's own spies saw in her the perfect target. They dug into her history, hungry for a misstep. Soon the whispers became a storm. The king, whose ego could not bear humiliation, was presented with evidence of Katherine's so-called betrayal. It was nothing more than the story of a lonely teenager, pressured and manipulated, but in the language of the Tudor court it was treason. Her past was twisted into a weapon against her. The king felt mocked, exposed, and there was no greater sin than embarrassing Henry VIII. The investigation was relentless and cruel. Katherine's rooms were searched, her servants interrogated, her letters seized and examined for any trace of indiscretion. One by one her friends were dragged in, broken down, and forced to confess details they barely understood. The court that once cheered her beauty now recoiled in delight at her shame. The same men who had flirted with her in corridors now pointed fingers, desperate to save their own skins. Katherine herself was shattered by the betrayal. In the end, she was alone. No friends, no family, no champion at court. She was a child, abandoned and overwhelmed. When the king finally confronted her, Katherine broke. She confessed to past relationships, pleading for mercy, insisting she had been a child, not a traitor. But mercy was not the language of Henry's England. The king's rage was volcanic. He banished her from his sight, and a council of old men decided her fate. Her so-called confessions were read out as proof of her wickedness, but there was no trial worthy of the name, only a show trial designed to justify the king's wrath. She was declared guilty of treason, stripped of her title, and condemned to die. The days before her execution were a torment beyond imagining. Katherine was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same cold fortress that had swallowed queens and courtiers before her. Alone in her cell, she waited for the dawn she knew would never bring freedom. According to legend, though history cannot confirm it, she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it. She was 17, rehearsing her own death while the world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. The morning of her execution, February 13, 1542, was grim and gray. Katherine wore a somber dress and walked with trembling dignity to the scaffold. The crowd gathered to see the spectacle, some curious, some vengeful, some mourning the waste of a life barely begun. Katherine spoke only a few words, expressing regret for her mistakes and asking for God's mercy. She was forced to kneel, her hair tucked away, the block cold beneath her skin. With a single swing of the axe, her life ended. A queen erased not for a crime of politics, but for the sin of being young and used. Katherine's death was a warning, a reminder that in the Tudor court the rules could change overnight, and even innocence could be transformed into a mortal offense. Her story was twisted for propaganda, painted as a tale of lust and betrayal. But the truth is simpler and darker. She was a child crushed by the ambition and fear of those far more powerful. Her mistakes were not treason. They were the mistakes of a girl growing up in a world that had no mercy for weakness or youth. In the years after her execution, Henry VIII would marry once more, but the shadows never left his court. The memory of Katherine haunted the palace, the laughter of a girl, the glimmer of hope, the echo of screams in the tower. History tried to forget her or to reduce her to a cautionary footnote. But if you listen closely to the stone walls of the Tower of London, you might still hear the silent terror of a teenager who never had a chance to become anything more than a victim of other people's ambitions. Catherine Howard's fate was not sealed by her actions, but by the world she was born into, a world where girls were pawns, where men wrote the rules, and where survival itself was an act of rebellion. She was not guilty of treason. She was guilty only of being young and in the wrong place at the wrong time, surrounded by those who would rather destroy innocence than admit their own sins. Her story is a plea across centuries. Do not let power write over the truth. Remember Katherine, not as a scandal, but as a lost child who deserves so much more than the blade. Her name endures, not as a villain, but as a question. How many others, young and defenseless, were erased by history's hunger for order and blame? Katherine Howard was executed for mistakes any teenager could make, but the crime was never hers. It belonged to the world that demanded blood instead of compassion, silence instead of justice, and power at any cost. Mary Tudor ordered hundreds of women to the stake. She was crowned in a storm of hope and dread, a woman raised in palaces, exiled to the margins, now suddenly the most powerful person in England. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon, began her reign as a symbol of legitimacy and lost innocence. Yet, by its end, her name would echo through history in a single word: bloody. The road to the stake was paved with her childhood wounds and England's broken faith. Mary had watched her mother cast aside, her religion outlawed, her childhood declared illegitimate. These scars twisted into purpose as she took the throne in 1553. She would restore the true faith, whatever it cost. In Mary's mind, every heretic was a wound upon her soul, a shadow over her mother's memory. And shadows demand fire. The Protestant reforms of her father and brother had turned England into a battlefield of the spirit, with families divided, pulpits at war, and every parish haunted by suspicion. When Mary ordered the country back to Catholicism, it was more than policy. It was revenge, ritual, and an exorcism of everything she'd lost. She signed death warrants with a trembling but relentless hand. Over 280 people would burn in less than 4 years, among them mothers, daughters, widows, and girls barely old enough to speak in court. In these flames, England was meant to remember the old order and to fear the price of questioning it. To be a woman accused of heresy in Mary's England was to fall into a world where law and rumor blurred, where the scent of smoke was never far from your dreams. It began with whispers, a neighbor, a rival, a priest suspicious of a book, or a prayer said in English. The machinery of terror rolled forward. Sometimes women were accused for teaching their children to read the Bible at home or for refusing to attend Mass. Sometimes it was enough to be the wife or daughter of a Protestant already condemned. Their words twisted into evidence, their silence into guilt. Trial was a performance. Judges already knew their lines. The accused stood alone in the dock, surrounded by men in crimson robes and iron faces, their only hope a quick death or a last-minute recantation. Most refused to renounce their faith. They spoke with quiet terror, not for themselves, but for the children and families left behind. Some prayed aloud in English, their voices defiant until the last. Some collapsed in tears, overcome by the terror of what was to come. The journey to the stake was slow and public, designed to make examples out of women who would not bend. Crowds gathered, some curious, some hungry for blood, some weeping with secret sympathy. The condemned were dressed in plain gowns, sometimes barefoot, sometimes clutching the hands of their daughters, knowing their final lesson would be given in fire. Children watched as mothers and grandmothers were bound to the posts, straw and faggots piled high around their feet. Mary's loyal bishops presided, reading the charges aloud so the crowd would know this was not murder but holy judgment. Prayers were offered, sometimes rejected. The torch was brought forward, the fire lit. For a moment, the wind would carry the crackling roar and the screams through the city. Some women sang hymns as the flames rose, their voices breaking as the heat climbed their bodies. Some bit their tongues in silence, refusing to give their tormentors satisfaction. The smell of burning flesh became a haunting memory, a warning, a lesson burned into the bones of every witness. Mary's regime believed that each burning was a victory for the soul of England, a purification by pain, a return to the unity of faith. But each execution also fed the legend of Bloody Mary. Underground Protestant presses told stories of the martyrs. Alice Driver, burned for teaching Scripture to her children. Elizabeth Warren, who refused to denounce her friends. Countless wives and mothers whose names are now lost, remembered only in lists and the nightmares of survivors. Women who chose agony over the betrayal of their conscience. The flames that rose from Smithfield and Oxford cast shadows all the way to the present. Shadows where a queen's legacy is never free from the stench of smoke. Mary's own life became a labyrinth of guilt and fury. The executions weighed on her, but she would not be swayed. She saw herself as a savior, rescuing England's soul from the abyss. She believed every burning was a necessary evil, a price to be paid for lost unity, for her mother's memory, for the salvation of a kingdom at war with itself. But the people remembered differently. Fear drove faith underground. Secret Bibles were passed from hand to hand. Children learned prayers in darkness, terrified that a single wrong word would send their family to the pyre. By the time Mary died in 1558, her body broken and her throne already slipping away, she had restored the Mass but lost the hearts of her people. Her dream of a Catholic England died with her, swept away by the Protestant tide that followed. But the memory of those women, burned not for treason, not for crime, but for the stubborn, silent act of believing differently, remains a wound in the story of power. It is a warning. The fires set by rulers in the name of unity will one day illuminate their own failures, and the women they tried to silence will echo long after the flames have died. In the cold dawn after Mary's death, England learned to fear the edge of faith and the reach of the state. Her reign became a lesson written in blood and bone, a grim fairy tale mothers whispered to daughters. Never speak too loudly, never trust the mercy of power, never forget that even queens can become monsters if the world lets them burn enough of their own people. And so, in every candle flicker and every silent prayer, the memory of the women who met fire in the name of faith persists. Fierce, stubborn, unforgettable. The world will always remember Bloody Mary, not for her prayers or her policies, but for the day she chose the stake over mercy and believed the flames could save what was already lost. Jane Boleyn betrayed her own family, then faced the same fate. She entered history as Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, a name whispered with suspicion, rarely with sympathy. Born Jane Parker, she married George Boleyn, brother to the dazzling Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. Jane was clever, observant, always present on the periphery of Tudor power, always watching. In the brutal, shifting world of the English court, being an observer was sometimes the only way to survive. But Jane didn't just survive. She became infamous, remembered as the woman who betrayed her own family, and then, when the tide turned, was abandoned by the very machine that had used her. In 1536, the Tudor world exploded. Anne Boleyn, once queen, became the target of Henry VIII's wrath, accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were built on rumors and confessions wrung out through terror. Jane, wife of George, was summoned to testify. What did she say? Centuries later, historians still debate the precise words. But what matters is that her evidence helped destroy both her husband and her sister-in-law. George Boleyn was executed, his head struck from his body. Anne Boleyn, once crowned with glory, fell to the axe as well. Jane survived, but she did so surrounded by silence and suspicion. Did she betray them out of jealousy, fear, ambition? Or was she, too, a victim, forced to speak under unimaginable pressure? The truth, as always in Tudor history, is tangled. Jane returned to court. The corridors were the same, but the air was colder now. She wore black, mourning the Boleyns, but mourning herself as well, a woman cut off from everything she had known. But power needed her. The court needed her. She became a lady-in-waiting to the next queen, Jane Seymour, and then to Anne of Cleves, and then to young Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, swept into the storm of Henry's obsession. Jane, now older, perhaps a little hardened, became Catherine's confidant. But it was a confidence built on secrets and risk. Catherine loved another, Thomas Culpeper, a dangerous, foolish love. Jane arranged secret meetings, passed messages, covered for her queen. Why? Was it loyalty or desperation or a hunger to be at the center of the story again? History offers no easy answer. But Jane, always on the edge, was now over it. The court discovered the affair. The king's wrath was absolute. Catherine was accused of adultery, an unpardonable crime for a queen. Jane, implicated as her accomplice, was arrested, interrogated, and finally imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now, after years spent maneuvering through the shadows, Jane faced the same machinery of accusation that she had once helped to turn. Madness overtook her. Alone in her cell, tormented by guilt, grief, and the terror of what awaited her, Jane lost her grip on reality. But Henry VIII was unyielding. Parliament passed a law so she could be executed even in her madness, an act of cold calculation, a reminder that in Tudor England, mercy was for the lucky, never the used. On a cold February morning in 1542, Jane Boleyn was led to the scaffold alongside Catherine Howard. The same axe that had claimed her husband now hovered over her. She met her end with trembling dignity, her final words lost to time, her legacy written not in victory, but in betrayal and ruin. Jane Boleyn's story is a labyrinth of motives, a tragedy of a woman trapped between ambition and fear, power and helplessness. She was used, discarded, and finally destroyed by the court she had once served. In her fate, the cruelty of the Tudor world is laid bare, a place where yesterday's tool is today's traitor, and no amount of loyalty can save you from becoming the next sacrifice on the altar of royal survival. Jane Boleyn, who lived in the shadow of queens and the silence of executioners, became a warning that in the end power devours all, even those who think themselves invisible. Bess of Hardwick survived 4 marriages and built a fortune. Picture a world where every step you take is over a hidden trap, where ambition is a silent predator, and the glittering world of Tudor England is as deadly as it is dazzling. In this perilous world, one woman rose from near nothing to become one of the most powerful, wealthy, and enigmatic figures of her era. Her name was Bess of Hardwick, and her story is proof that survival in Tudor England wasn't just about luck. It was about intelligence, resilience, and a razor-sharp instinct for power. Bess was born Elizabeth Hardwick in 1527 into the lower ranks of England's rural gentry. Her family wasn't rich, but they had just enough land, just enough status to matter, barely. England at the time was a land of shifting fortunes. Henry VIII's court was ablaze with intrigue, and even the smallest connection could turn a life from obscurity to influence or ruin. For Bess, childhood meant watching her family struggle to maintain their grip on a fading legacy. She learned early that survival was not promised, and that fortunes could be made or lost in the blink of an eye. Her journey began with a marriage, as was customary for girls of her class. She was barely in her teens when she wed Robert Barlow, an arrangement designed to anchor her family's position. But fate, sometimes cruel and sometimes kind, intervened. Barlow died soon after, and though the marriage was short, it left Bess with a taste of independence and a small but important inheritance. In a world where widows often faded into the background, Bess saw opportunity. She didn't just remarry, she chose her husbands, like a chess master selects pieces, each move calculated for maximum advantage. Her second marriage to Sir William Cavendish marked the true beginning of her ascent. Cavendish was wealthy, well-connected, and ambitious. With him, Bess became a central figure in the bustling, treacherous court of King Edward VI and then Queen Mary. She moved with uncanny skill through court politics, learning how to speak when spoken to, and more importantly, how to listen when silence was power. She and Cavendish embarked on a grand project, the building of Chatsworth House, a mansion that would rival the palaces of the greatest nobles. Bess poured herself into the task, learning about construction, land management, and the secrets of turning stone and timber into status and security. When Cavendish died, Bess was once again a widow, but this time she was wealthy, experienced, and determined never to be powerless again. Bess's third marriage was to Sir William St. Lo, a powerful courtier and captain of the guard for Queen Elizabeth I. This union brought her closer to the very heart of royal power. St. Lo adored her, and upon his death he left her his entire estate, cutting out other heirs in favor of Bess. Now she was not just wealthy, she was rich beyond the dreams of most men in England. But in the dangerous waters of Elizabethan court life, even great wealth could not protect you from enemies, jealous rivals, or the lethal whims of the Queen. Yet Bess persisted. Her final marriage to George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was her most audacious move. As Countess of Shrewsbury, Bess managed vast estates and navigated the daily peril of serving as guardian to the captive Mary, Queen of Scots. This role, meant to be an honor, was in fact a prison, a constant test of loyalty, patience, and cunning. One slip, one wrong word, and Bess could have lost everything to the Queen's wrath or to the endless plots that churned through the Tudor world. But she was unbreakable. Bess and her fourth husband, though their marriage was stormy, worked together to expand her fortune and influence. She invested wisely in land and properties. She supervised the construction of Hardwick Hall, an architectural marvel designed as both a fortress and a symbol, a statement to the world that Bess of Hardwick was untouchable, her power visible in every stone and glass window. The house itself is emblazoned with her initials, E.S., a bold signature in a world where most women could barely leave a mark. Bess's story is a masterclass in survival. She outlived 4 husbands, managed countless estates, and married her children into the highest ranks of English nobility. She endured scandal, gossip, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of royal suspicion. Yet she emerged, time and again, richer and more powerful than before. Every move was deliberate, every risk calculated. She turned her widowhood into strength, her gender into a weapon, her fortune into a dynasty. But the real secret of Bess's success was her ability to read the currents of her time. She knew when to speak and when to keep silent, when to trust and when to betray. She played the role expected of her, pious wife, loyal subject, humble widow, while building an empire beneath the surface. Even as men around her fell to misfortune, execution, or disgrace, Bess endured. Her survival was not luck, it was strategy, willpower, and the cold courage to do whatever it took to win. When Bess died in 1608, she left behind a legacy unlike any other. Her descendants would sit on the throne of England. Her estates would remain among the grandest in the land. And her name, Bess of Hardwick, would become a symbol of what was possible, even in the most dangerous times, for those willing to risk everything for greatness. Centuries later, her hall still stands, her initials shining in the glass, daring anyone to forget the woman who survived 4 marriages, outlasted queens and kings, and carved her name into the very bones of England. Queen Elizabeth was nearly killed by her own sister. In the labyrinthine world of Tudor England, power was a game of shadows, and survival meant walking a razor's edge between loyalty and betrayal. Elizabeth Tudor, destined to become one of England's most legendary monarchs, was not always the unshakable queen history remembers. Once she was a frightened young woman, barely more than a girl, imprisoned by her own half-sister, Mary I, the reigning queen, suspected of treason, trapped in a castle that had become a tomb in all but name. Her survival was not destiny. It was a miracle shaped by luck, wit, and the very real threat of an executioner's blade. Elizabeth's peril began the moment her father, Henry VIII, died, and the succession passed not to her but to her younger brother, Edward VI. Under Edward's brief reign, England swayed further toward Protestant reform, but the young king's failing health opened the floodgates of ambition. In those years, plots were as common as prayers, and Elizabeth learned early that every smile in court might hide a knife. When Edward died, the throne should have passed to Mary, Henry's eldest daughter by Katherine of Aragon. But Protestant nobles tried to install Lady Jane Grey, another pawn, doomed by her royal blood. After 9 tragic days, Jane was swept aside and Mary Tudor claimed the crown. But Mary's triumph was fragile. As the first woman to rule England in her own right, she faced suspicion, resistance, and the bitter legacy of her mother's long humiliation. Mary was determined to reverse her father's break with Rome and restore Catholicism, but her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of the Protestant Anne Boleyn, became a living symbol of a rival England, one where the old ways would never return. Every day Mary's reign was threatened by whispers of rebellion, and in the world of Tudor politics, suspicion was all it took to end a life. The storm broke in 1554, when Wyatt's rebellion erupted. Angry at Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain and fearful of Catholic rule, Protestant conspirators rose in armed revolt. The plotters wanted to replace Mary with Elizabeth, who, despite her youth and careful denials, was already a beacon of hope for those opposed to Catholic restoration. The rebellion was crushed, but the damage was done. Mary's trust was shattered. Elizabeth was placed under house arrest, then summoned to London, interrogated by the Queen's Council, and finally, in a chilling journey through rain-soaked streets, sent to the Tower. It was a journey Elizabeth would never forget. She entered through Traitor's Gate, the same gate that had swallowed her mother, Anne Boleyn, just 2 decades before. The echo of that family tragedy hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth, only 20, was acutely aware that few prisoners emerged from the Tower alive. Mary's advisers pressed for blood. They found letters, rumors, supposed plots, enough circumstantial evidence to justify execution. But Elizabeth denied everything. She wept, pleaded, reasoned, maintaining her innocence with all the force of a young woman who knew her life was measured in days and hours. Inside her cold cell, Elizabeth was watched and isolated. Friends and loyal servants were barred from her side. Each day brought new interrogations, new accusations. Fear was her only companion. Across London, tension mounted. Some called for her death. Others, including powerful nobles and foreign ambassadors, warned Mary that to kill Elizabeth would stain her reign forever. The pressure grew, and for weeks Elizabeth's fate hung in the balance. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the tide shifted. Mary's government, lacking concrete evidence, hesitated. The people murmured. Even Mary, hardened by years of loss, seemed unable to sign the death warrant for her own blood. After weeks in the Tower, Elizabeth was released, but not to freedom. She was sent to house arrest at Woodstock, watched day and night. For nearly a year she lived as a prisoner, her fate tied to every rumor and every political whim. During these long, anxious months, Elizabeth showed a strength that would later define her rule. She cultivated allies in silence, wrote careful, measured letters, and refused to betray those who might have helped her. Above all, she refused to break. She knew the world watched, that every misstep could be fatal. Her survival became a legend even as it unfolded, her composure, her restraint, her refusal to admit to a crime she had not committed. When Mary's health began to fail and her reign faltered, Elizabeth's prospects brightened. The people, worn out by religious turmoil and fearful of Spanish influence, began to see in Elizabeth a hope for stability. By the time Mary died, broken by illness and disappointment, Elizabeth's position was secure. She rode into London as queen, not because she was born to rule, but because she had learned how to survive. She had lived through the worst that power could inflict, and she had emerged unbroken from the shadow of the Tower. Elizabeth's near execution became the crucible that forged her legend. She never forgot the terror of her imprisonment, nor the fragile nature of favor and fortune. It shaped her reign, her caution, her political genius, her refusal to marry or trust too deeply. She learned that power was both a weapon and a shield, and that mercy was as dangerous as vengeance. Her brush with death at her sister's hands haunted her for life, but it also made her the queen who would stand alone against every threat: Spanish armadas, internal plots, the loneliness of the crown. In the end, Elizabeth's survival was not just a twist of fate. It was the triumph of resilience over cruelty, of wit over brute force, of a woman who learned, in the hardest possible way, that the crown of England was won not on the battlefield, but in the hidden wars of the mind and heart. Her story is a reminder that even in an age ruled by swords and suspicion, the greatest victories were often won by those who simply refused to be broken. Margaret Clitherow was crushed to death for hiding priests. Imagine the sound of footsteps on ancient stone, the distant echo of church bells, and the heavy silence of fear. England in 1586 was a nation at war with itself, not on battlefields, but in the secret chambers of faith and conscience. The world of Margaret Clitherow was one where belief could get you killed, and silence could be more dangerous than words. Her story is not just about martyrdom. It's about the terrifying cost of standing for something true, even when the world demands your voice be crushed into silence. Margaret Clitherow was born in York, a city where the old stones remembered centuries of Catholic tradition. But after Henry VIII broke from Rome, England was no longer a safe place for those who clung to the old faith. Every Mass, every whispered prayer in Latin, every hidden priest was now an act of rebellion. The Protestant authorities saw Catholicism as a threat to the very heart of the state, and laws against Catholics grew more savage each year. In this world Margaret grew up, married a Protestant butcher named John Clitherow, and lived her outward life as a respectable woman of York. But inside her home another world flickered, a world of secret faith, of risk and defiance, where loyalty to conscience was worth more than loyalty to law. Margaret converted to Catholicism as a young woman, at a time when being caught at Mass could mean prison, torture, or worse. Her house became a sanctuary, a place where priests could hide from pursuers, where sacred objects could be concealed in the walls, where forbidden rites could be celebrated in silence. She taught her children the old prayers, risked her safety to protect the hunted, and lived with the constant terror of betrayal. Every knock at the door could be the last. The authorities knew her reputation. They watched, they waited, and finally, they acted. Margaret was arrested after a frightened schoolboy, under interrogation, revealed her secret. The charge was not murder nor theft, but the simple act of harboring priests, men who, in the eyes of the state, represented a deadly threat to order. Margaret was dragged before the court and commanded to enter a plea, guilty or innocent. But she refused. To plead would be to legitimize a law she believed was unjust, to participate in her own condemnation, and worse, to put her children and friends at risk of torture and death as witnesses. So she stood silent, staring down her accusers, refusing to play their game. Under English law, that silence was itself a crime. The punishment was as medieval as it was monstrous. Peine forte et dure, pressing to death beneath a mountain of stones. This was not a quick death. It was designed to break the body and spirit, to force confession by agony, to make a spectacle of what happened to those who challenged the authority of the state. For Margaret, it was a final act of resistance, her silence a shield for those she loved. The morning of her execution, March 25, 1586, was cold and gray. Margaret was stripped and laid on her back in a dark cell, her arms spread wide. A sharp stone was placed beneath her spine, then a heavy door was laid across her body. One by one, immense stones were heaped onto the door, their weight growing with each passing moment. Her bones cracked, her lungs compressed, her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She was given no mercy, no relief, only the suffocating pressure of the world literally closing in. Witnesses said she called on Christ, praying for her children, forgiving her enemies, and refusing to give the authorities the satisfaction of her agony. She died in about 15 minutes, but her body was left beneath the stones for hours, a public warning against disobedience. The people of York, many of whom respected Margaret for her charity and kindness, were horrified. But the machinery of power rolled on, unbothered by the blood it spilled. Margaret's husband was left alone, her children orphaned, and the Catholic underground was dealt another blow. Yet even in death Margaret became a symbol, the woman who chose to be crushed rather than betray her faith, the mother who would not endanger her children even as the world demanded her submission. The story of Margaret Clitherow is a window into an era when every moment of conscience was an act of rebellion. She was not a warrior, not a politician, not a leader of armies. She was a mother, a wife, an ordinary woman who became extraordinary by refusing to yield. The stones that broke her body could not erase her story. In the years that followed, secret Catholics whispered her name in prayers, drew strength from her sacrifice, and carried on the struggle in hidden chapels and locked rooms. History would eventually recognize her courage. In 1970, Margaret Clitherow was canonized as a saint, her name joined with other martyrs who refused to bend to tyranny. But her legacy is more than sainthood or legend. It's a reminder that the true test of conviction is not grand speeches or public defiance, but the willingness to pay the ultimate price in silence, knowing your sacrifice may never be understood. Margaret's death was meant to terrify, but it became a rallying cry. Her refusal to plead, her strength in the face of impossible pain, exposes the brutality of a system that could crush a woman for her beliefs, and the quiet, unstoppable force of conscience that survives even the heaviest stones. Her story is not just about faith. It is about the human spirit's refusal to be silenced, no matter how much weight the world tries to press down. In the end, Margaret Clitherow was not just crushed by stones. She was crushed by the fears and hatreds of her time, by laws that demanded conformity at any cost. Yet, through her suffering, she gave witness to a different law, one written in the silence between her words, in the courage it takes to risk everything for what you know is right. That courage can never be pressed out of the world, no matter how many stones are stacked upon it. Her name endures as proof that the weight of injustice can break bodies, but not the truth. Arbella Stuart was locked in the Tower until her death. She was born into a world of shadows and whispers, a world where royal blood was a blessing and a curse, where your name could become your sentence. Arbella Stuart carried the legacy of kings in her veins, her every step watched, every word weighed. The granddaughter of Margaret Douglas and great-granddaughter of Henry VII, she lived forever on the edge of a throne she could never claim. From her earliest days, Arbella was not seen as a child, but as a piece on the vast, dangerous chessboard of Tudor and Stuart ambition. Her very existence was a threat, her lineage a double-edged sword pressed to her own throat. England at the dawn of the 17th century was restless, haunted by memories of bloodshed and plots. Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, ruled with iron and paranoia, her court a theater of secrets. In the shadows, the question of succession hung like a curse. Arbella's name surfaced in conspiracies and whispered prayers alike, a girl whose presence unsettled queens and kept courtiers up at night. She was surrounded by watchful eyes, raised in privileged captivity, always close enough to taste power, but never free to pursue it. Arbella's childhood was a study in isolation. She was sheltered in grand, lonely houses, raised not to play, but to be watched. Every letter she sent was intercepted, every visitor examined. Her family's ambition for her was both armor and shackle. She learned to perform obedience while her mind raced with silent rebellion. Her value was in her blood, and so she became her own jailer, never knowing whom to trust, always aware that a careless word could end everything. When Elizabeth died and James VI of Scotland became James I of England, Arbella's fortunes should have changed. But the new king saw her not as family, but as a rival. James was determined to erase threats before they could become rebellions. For Arbella, the Golden Age was over before it began. She lived under the gaze of a court that alternately courted and feared her. She was allowed to dress in silks and pearls, to dance at masques, but she was never allowed to decide her fate. Suitors were vetted and dismissed, rumors of marriage proposals whispered and then snuffed out by the king's will. But even a royal prisoner can dream of freedom. Arbella's life changed forever when she met William Seymour, another heir with royal blood. They were drawn together by fate, by loneliness, by the shared burden of being born too close to the throne. Against all royal commands, Arbella and William married in secret, a desperate act of love and rebellion in a world where marriage was a political weapon. The king saw not romance, but treason. Two rival bloodlines, joined without his approval, was an act too dangerous to ignore. The hammer fell. Arbella was arrested, William sent to the Tower. Their secret marriage became a death sentence. James was ruthless. He knew that love, when combined with royal blood, could ignite wars. Arbella was moved from house arrest to prison, from locked rooms to the cold stone corridors of the Tower of London. The couple tried to escape. Disguised and desperate, Arbella fled in men's clothes, William from another prison. They almost made it. But fate, or the king's long reach, caught them both. Arbella was captured before she could reach the sea. The Tower was not just a prison, but a slow execution. Arbella was kept alone, her health and spirit steadily eroded. Letters from William were intercepted. Food was rationed, visitors denied. The walls themselves seemed to close in, each day a little colder, each night a little longer. Some say she starved herself in despair, others that neglect and slow poison did the work of the executioner. She faded from public memory even as her story became a legend, a royal woman erased not with the axe or fire, but by the slow violence of isolation and neglect. No trial, no public accusation, no last speech. Arbella's death was meant to be quiet, unremarkable, a footnote in the king's careful rewriting of the royal family tree. When she died in 1615, alone and defeated, there was no great mourning, no national grief. But for those who still remember the terror and beauty of Tudor ambition, Arbella's ghost lingered. Her story became a warning whispered in palace corridors. Even a princess with the blood of kings can vanish if her existence threatens the designs of power. She was buried without the honors due her rank, her grave unmarked for years. The official record said little, but legend filled in the silence. Some said Arbella died of heartbreak, others that she refused food until her body failed. Some claimed the king ordered her death, that starvation and madness were quieter tools than sword or stake. In every version, the same lesson is there. Power does not need to kill you quickly. Sometimes it only needs to wait, to watch you wither in a gilded cage. Arbella's story echoes down the centuries, a portrait of a woman crushed not by open violence, but by the endless, patient machinery of suspicion and control. She reminds us that prisons do not always have visible bars, that the gravest wounds can be inflicted in silence, in shadow, behind the locked doors of a palace. Hers was the fate of the too royal, the too dangerous, a woman whose only crime was love and the accident of her blood. In her lonely cell, Arbella Stuart became a symbol, not of treason, but of all those who suffer in the name of political safety, whose dreams are smothered by the fear of what might happen if they were ever allowed to live freely. Centuries later, her life remains a puzzle and a warning. In every forgotten corner of the Tower, in every love letter intercepted, and every window barred against hope, her story asks the question no king can silence. What does it mean to be royal if your only crown is the weight of what you must never do, and your only legacy is the echo of a life that power was too afraid to let unfold? Katherine of Aragon fought the church for her crown. She was born a Spanish princess, trained for destiny, and taught to believe in the sacred right of queenship. Yet, Katherine of Aragon would end her life in exile, stripped of her crown, her name, and the world she'd spent decades defending. Her story is a clash of dynasties, a battle between love and law, and at its core, a portrait of relentless resolve in the face of betrayal so public it shook Europe to its foundation. For 24 years, Katherine was Queen of England, Henry VIII's partner, consort, and rival in a power game where only one voice would survive. Katherine arrived in England as a teenager, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, monarchs who had unified Spain, driven out the Moors, and sent Columbus across the sea. She carried that same iron in her soul. First, she was married to Prince Arthur, Henry's elder brother. When he died suddenly, Katherine's fate hung in the balance. She claimed the marriage was never consummated, a technicality that would become the linchpin of English history. Years of waiting followed. She endured poverty, isolation, and endless uncertainty until Henry VIII claimed her as his wife. Their wedding was a victory for both kingdoms, their early years marked by warmth and hope. Katherine was not just a queen by marriage, she was a queen by nature. She governed when Henry left for war, presided over the royal court, and became beloved for her charity and piety. She was fiercely intelligent, able to debate with scholars, write in Latin, and govern a kingdom as skillfully as any man. But the one thing she could not do was provide Henry with a living son. One child after another died. Only Mary, their daughter, survived. With each loss, Katherine's power wavered. Henry's love cooled, and his ambition sharpened. As the years passed, Henry's eye fell on Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting with a sharp wit and sharper ambitions. Anne was young, clever, and unwilling to be Henry's mistress. She wanted to be queen, and Henry, frustrated, desperate for a son, decided to make it so. But to do that, he needed to rid himself of Katherine. Henry claimed their marriage was cursed, that God had punished them for violating the laws of kinship. Katherine was summoned to court, told to step aside, to surrender her crown, her marriage, her place in history. But Katherine refused. She argued her case in public and private, refusing to be silent. When summoned before Henry and his council at Blackfriars, she fell to her knees and spoke directly to the king, reminding him and everyone present of her 20 years of loyalty, her royal blood, her suffering. She would not be set aside, not for a younger woman, not for an heir, not even for a king who was ready to remake the world to suit his will. The battle became more than a marriage. It became a war for England's soul. The Pope, unwilling to offend Katherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused to grant Henry an annulment. Henry, enraged, broke with Rome, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and forced his bishops and subjects to accept Anne as his true wife. Katherine was banished from court, forbidden to see her daughter Mary, stripped of her title, and sent to live in crumbling castles far from the glitter of power. But even in exile, she did not surrender. She continued to sign her letters as queen, refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn, and demanded the loyalty of her household. Her life became a slow, public martyrdom. She lived on meager means, watched her health fail, and endured the heartbreak of separation from Mary, the daughter who was her last living legacy. Courtiers wept at her stoicism. Her enemies whispered that she was stubborn, proud, outdated. But Katherine's resistance had already changed the course of history. Her refusal to bend forced Henry to break England from the Catholic Church, set the stage for decades of religious violence, and ensured that her daughter, Mary, would one day become queen in her own right. In the cold of Kimbolton Castle, her last prison, Katherine wrote her final letters. She forgave Henry, blessed Mary, and accepted her fate. When she died in 1536, even her enemies could not deny her dignity. Henry and Anne celebrated her passing, but history has remembered Katherine differently. She was the queen who fought the church, the king, and the entire world to keep her crown, not for vanity, but for principle, for faith, for the promise made before God. Her strength exposed the cruelty of Tudor politics and the price paid by women who would not be silent. In the end, Katherine of Aragon lost everything except her honor. She was buried not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales. Yet in refusing to yield, Katherine became something more powerful than any crown. She became a legend. Her story is not just one of defeat, but of resistance so fierce it forced an empire to tremble, a faith so unbreakable it still echoes in the bones of English history. The woman cast aside became the conscience of a nation, a silent force standing between one king's desire and the relentless machinery of power. Elizabeth I survived a dozen assassination plots. In the shadows of Tudor England, where candlelight flickered across cold stone walls and every whisper could mean betrayal, Elizabeth I sat upon a throne surrounded by danger. Her reign was a miracle of survival, a game played at the highest stakes, where every move, every letter, every gesture could mean life or death. She was not supposed to live, let alone rule. But against all odds, Elizabeth endured and became a legend. She was born into chaos. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, lost her head to the axe. Her father, Henry VIII, left behind a kingdom fractured by religious war and mistrust. As a young girl, Elizabeth watched queens come and go, often to the scaffold. She learned early that trust was a luxury and survival required cunning. By the time she inherited the throne in 1558, Elizabeth's life had already been marked by peril, a template for the decades to come. From the moment Elizabeth became queen, the threats began. To many Catholics, she was a heretic and a usurper, a bastard born of an invalid marriage. The Pope himself declared her illegitimate, inviting her enemies to remove her by any means necessary. Europe's greatest powers, the Spanish, the French, even disaffected English nobles, saw her as both obstacle and opportunity. Assassination plots began almost as soon as her coronation celebrations ended. Elizabeth's response was nothing short of revolutionary. She surrounded herself with some of the sharpest minds and coldest hearts in England, men like William Cecil, her tireless adviser, and Sir Francis Walsingham, the shadowy spymaster who would become the father of English espionage. Walsingham built a web of informers, double agents, and codebreakers that stretched from the London docks to the courts of Europe. Secret messages were intercepted, plots uncovered before they could ignite. Letters in invisible ink were brought to the Queen's attention. Every threat became another test of her government's nerve and intellect. But the threats kept coming. The first great storm was the Northern Rebellion of 1569, when Catholic nobles in the north of England rose in hopes of replacing Elizabeth with her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. The plot failed, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Mary would become both a prisoner and a symbol, the focus of nearly every conspiracy against Elizabeth's life. The Ridolfi plot, backed by Spanish money and papal blessing, aimed to kill Elizabeth and set Mary on the throne. Only Walsingham's network, alert, relentless, ruthless, saved her. The Throckmorton plot and the Babington plot followed, each more daring and elaborate than the last, weaving together exiled nobles, foreign assassins, and secret codes smuggled in beer barrels. The stakes were clear: one successful dagger, one vial of poison, and the entire future of England would be rewritten in an instant. Elizabeth did not cower. She moved with extraordinary care, balancing mercy and terror. She made a show of tolerance, but when pushed, she struck with iron resolve. After the Babington plot, when evidence revealed Mary, Queen of Scots, had consented to her cousin's murder, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant with a trembling hand, a decision that haunted her but secured her crown. The queen who survived did so at a cost. She sacrificed friendships, banished advisers, and sent old allies to the block. But each time the axe fell, the message was clear. Betrayal would be met with merciless force. Beyond plots and poison, there were open threats. Catholic priests trained in France and Rome slipped into England under false names, risking torture and death to inspire rebellion. Every Mass held in secret, every confession whispered in a hidden chapel, was another spark that could light the fire of civil war. Elizabeth's government unleashed a new breed of pursuivants, relentless trackers who raided homes, interrogated suspects, and filled the dungeons with those suspected of disloyalty. The air itself was thick with suspicion. In 1588, the most visible threat of all emerged: the Spanish Armada, a fleet sent not just to invade, but to destroy Elizabeth and replace her with a Catholic monarch. England stood on the brink of catastrophe. But again, Elizabeth endured. Her speeches, delivered in armor to her trembling troops, became legend. "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The Armada was defeated, scattered by English fire and the merciless winds of the Channel. Yet even in the aftermath, Elizabeth knew peace was an illusion. Assassins still stalked her court. Poisoned gifts and hidden daggers appeared in rumors and confessions. Her food tasters, her guards, her closest companions, no one could be completely trusted. In her last years, the Queen's eyes seemed to see every threat before it moved, her mind sharp as ever. She wore thick makeup to hide the scars of time, but her intellect never faded. She ruled through force of will and an unbreakable commitment to her own survival. Elizabeth's greatest weapon, however, was always her mind. She understood the theater of monarchy, how to use fear and hope, grace and intimidation in equal measure. She played her suitors off one another, made allies and rivals dance for her favor, and left no opening for those who would destroy her. She transformed her court into a stage where every gesture was a warning, every smile a shield. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind a nation transformed, not just by war and politics, but by the simple fact that she had survived. She had outlasted assassins, rebellions, plots, and armies. She had endured loneliness, betrayal, and the constant shadow of death. Her reign is remembered as a golden age, but it was built on vigilance, sacrifice, and a will to survive that never faltered, not for a single day. Elizabeth's legacy is more than just her victories. It is the lesson that true power lies not in brute strength, but in the ability to adapt, to anticipate danger, and to never yield. She remains an icon of endurance, a queen who faced a world of daggers with nothing but her intellect, her courage, and an unyielding sense of destiny. Anne Boleyn was executed after a secret court trial. The rise and fall of Anne Boleyn is one of history's most chilling tales of power, betrayal, and the fatal games of the Tudor court. She began as a bright, witty outsider in King Henry VIII's England, a woman whose dark eyes and quick mind seduced not just a king, but an entire kingdom's fate. Yet in the end, she met her death on a scaffold, beheaded not by the English axe, but by a French sword, a rare mercy in a world that rarely offered any. To truly understand why Anne Boleyn died, you have to step into the feverish atmosphere of Henry's reign, where every glance could be a threat and every word a weapon. Anne's journey to power was as unlikely as it was dramatic. She was not born royal, but she was bred for courtly intrigue, educated in the dazzling courts of the continent, and learned to play the dangerous game of love and politics with extraordinary skill. Her refusal to become Henry's mistress set her apart. She became an obsession, the woman for whom a king would tear his kingdom from the Pope, rewrite the laws of marriage, and ignite a religious revolution that would shape England for centuries. For 7 years, Henry chased Anne, desperate for a son and an heir, willing to defy the world just to have her. Yet from the moment Anne became queen, the dangers multiplied. The country was divided. Many hated her as the woman who destroyed the beloved Queen Katherine, Henry's first wife. The nobility whispered that she had bewitched the king. Even her own allies feared her sharp tongue and ambition. Still, for 3 brief years, she held the throne, giving birth to the future Elizabeth I, though not, crucially, the longed-for male heir. Henry's frustration festered. The same passion that had raised Anne up now curdled into suspicion and cold distance. It was in this atmosphere of disappointment and rivalry that Anne's enemies began to plot her downfall. Henry, seeking a new wife and fresh hope for a son, was increasingly drawn to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting with a quiet, docile nature. Everything Anne was not. Suddenly, Anne's position was perilous. The queen who had inspired revolutions was now a liability, and in the deadly calculus of Tudor politics, a liability could not be tolerated. The accusations came suddenly, brutal and shocking. Anne was arrested and sent to the Tower of London, betrayed by those closest to her. She was charged with adultery, incest, and even plotting the king's death. The charges were outlandish, unsupported by real evidence, but in Henry's England, truth mattered less than the appearance of justice. The trial was held in secret, behind closed doors, with a jury hand-picked for loyalty to the king. Anne faced her accusers alone, without the support of friends or family. She denied everything, speaking with the same courage and intelligence that had once captivated the king. But her fate was already decided. The so-called trial lasted less than a day. Witnesses offered gossip and rumor as proof. 5 men, including Anne's own brother, were condemned alongside her. The verdict was inevitable, guilty on all counts. Anne was sentenced to die, her name blackened, her reputation destroyed. Yet even as she awaited execution, she maintained her composure, insisting on her innocence to the end. She spent her final days in prayer and reflection, not for herself alone, but for her daughter Elizabeth and the country that would soon remember her with both horror and fascination. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold. She wore a gray gown, a crimson robe, her dark hair tucked beneath a cap. Unlike most condemned nobles, Anne would not face the English executioner's axe. Henry, in a final gesture of twisted mercy, or perhaps a desire to avoid spectacle, had ordered an expert swordsman from France. The blade was razor-sharp, the technique swift and precise. Anne knelt, said a brief prayer, and forgave her enemies. In one stroke her life ended, her head severed cleanly, her dignity preserved in death, as it had so often been denied in life. The aftermath was as chilling as the execution itself. Anne's body was hurriedly buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower. Henry married Jane Seymour within days. The courtiers who once celebrated Anne quickly turned away, eager to please the new queen. But Anne's true legacy lived on, not in the twisted tales spread by her enemies, but in her daughter. Elizabeth would one day wear the crown her mother died for, transforming England forever. Anne Boleyn's story is a warning and a lesson. In the world of absolute power, love can be as dangerous as hate, and innocence is no shield against suspicion. Her death was not the result of justice, but of politics, paranoia, and a king's desperate need for control. Even centuries later, the image of Anne, bright, fierce, and ultimately broken, haunts the Tower and the very heart of English history. The sword that fell on her neck did not silence her story. Instead, it made her unforgettable, a queen whose life and death reshaped a nation. Mary, Queen of Scots, was betrayed and beheaded by family. Close your eyes and let yourself be transported to a windswept fortress in a cold, gray corner of England, where the fate of empires rests on a single, trembling life. Imagine the footsteps echoing through endless corridors, the clink of iron keys, the ever-watchful eyes of guards who do not know whether to pity or despise the woman they keep caged. This is the final chapter in the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman born to rule, yet doomed from birth to be both a prize and a pawn, hunted by the very blood that ran through her veins. Mary Stuart was royalty before she ever drew breath, Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old, sent away to France as a child bride, and crowned queen consort of a glittering foreign court before she had grown into herself. Her early life was painted in gold and candlelight, but beneath that surface glittered the dagger-sharp reality of Tudor and Stuart politics, where trust was a myth and family ties were used as shackles, not lifelines. Fate placed her on a collision course with her cousin, Elizabeth I of England, the only woman who could ever truly understand her, and the only one with the power to destroy her. For 19 long years, Mary was a prisoner, locked away in drafty castles and damp towers, always surrounded by walls that seemed to draw closer with every failed plot and whispered rumor. She became the living embodiment of a threat, a Catholic figurehead for those who dreamed of restoring the old faith in a Protestant land. Elizabeth, her cousin, never met her face to face. Instead, their relationship unfolded in letters laced with sorrow, envy, veiled threats, and desperate pleas. It was a game of thrones with no rules and no end, only the growing fear that one must die for the other to live. The web that finally snared Mary was spun not by her own hands, but by those who needed her gone, ambitious nobles, fearful counselors, and even her own kin. Accused of complicity in the Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and claim the English throne, Mary found herself trapped by forged letters, intercepted messengers, and the cunning of spies. Whether she was truly guilty or just a convenient scapegoat is lost to history. What mattered was the story the world needed to believe. She stood trial for a crime she may not have committed, denied legal counsel, denied the right to face her accusers, denied every mercy that might have been granted to any other sovereign. The verdict was never in doubt. In her final hours, Mary wrote a letter, one last appeal, one last chance to reach her cousin's heart. She did not beg for life. She begged for dignity, for the grace of a proper Catholic burial, for forgiveness for those who would kill her, and for the love of her son James. But mercy never came. Her fate was already decided, not in the courts, but in the locked chambers of Elizabeth's conscience. A conscience twisted by fear, jealousy, and the bitter understanding that only one queen could survive in this dangerous game. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary faced her death with a courage born not of arrogance, but of exhaustion and acceptance. Dressed in a gown of deep red, the color of martyrdom, she walked steadily to the scaffold, surrounded by hostile eyes and cold English stone. She spoke not with bitterness, but with grace, offering forgiveness to her executioners, praying for her enemies, and declaring her innocence to the last. The scene was almost unbearable in its intensity. The blindfold tied, her hands clasped around her rosary, the headsman's axe rising above her neck. The first blow missed, slicing into bone. The second was true. In that moment, a life filled with hope, heartbreak, and betrayal was snuffed out, a candle extinguished, leaving only the echo of her final prayer and the shuddering silence of those who had come to watch her die. Mary's death did not end the struggle. Instead, it haunted Elizabeth, whose guilt and nightmares lingered long after the crowds had drifted away. Mary's son, James, would one day ascend the English throne, uniting the crowns that had torn his mother's life apart. The world remembered Mary not as a villain, but as a tragic queen, a woman betrayed by her own blood, sacrificed to the machinery of power, and immortalized by the words she wrote as the end drew near. Her story is a warning written in blood that even those born to rule are not safe from envy, fear, and the relentless hunger of history. If you listen closely to the winds around Fotheringhay Castle, you can almost hear the last trembling notes of Mary's voice, asking not for revenge, but for understanding. She was betrayed not only by those who called themselves her family, but by the very idea that power is ever worth the price of a human soul. Her legacy endures as a testament to the darkness that lies at the heart of ambition, and the heartbreaking courage of those who, even in chains, refused to be broken. Lady Rochford was executed after losing royal favor. Her name was Jane Boleyn, but history remembers her by her title, Lady Rochford, a woman who walked through the fires of Tudor power and lost herself in its shadows. Born Jane Parker, she grew up among England's nobility, taught to read the room before she learned to read a book, trained to survive by her wit and her silence. She married George Boleyn, brother to Anne Boleyn, and so her fate was forever lashed to a family that flew too close to the sun. At court, alliances shifted like tides. Jane learned to navigate a world where a word could mean life or death, where friendship was as sharp as betrayal. She witnessed Anne's meteoric rise, Henry VIII's beloved queen, radiant and cunning, promising a new world. But Jane saw, too, the cost of ambition, the sudden terror, the whispers, the knives waiting in the dark. In 1536, Anne and George fell together, charged with treason, incest, and adultery, the evidence twisted and conjured from shadows. Jane's testimony, whether born of self-preservation or courtly pressure, helped to seal their fate. Her husband and sister-in-law went to the block, and Jane was left behind, not triumphant but haunted, her reputation forever smeared by the blood of those closest to her. Yet the Tudor world devoured the guilty and the innocent alike. Jane survived, but survival came at a price. She drifted at court, clinging to her title, her fortune diminished, her friends wary. Some called her a traitor, others pitied her, a woman trapped in the wreckage of a royal storm she could neither escape nor command. Years passed, monarchs changed, but the machinery of suspicion ground on. Jane lived in its grinding gears, her days a careful balance of smiles, secrets, and dread. When Henry took his fifth wife, Katherine Howard, Jane found herself again in the Queen's service. Katherine was a girl, a teenager with a hungry heart, swept into a court that devoured innocence. Henry was aging, gout-ridden, his charm curdled by suspicion. Katherine longed for laughter, for freedom, for love that wasn't shadowed by power. In secret, she began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a favorite of the king. And Lady Rochford, perhaps remembering her own ruined past, or maybe simply seeking purpose in another's passion, agreed to help them meet. She arranged trysts, passed messages, unlocked doors that should have stayed closed. But in Henry's England, secrets were currency and poison in the same breath. Whispers found ears, and ears served the crown. The web of intrigue unraveled. The Queen's liaisons came to light, and the trap snapped shut. Katherine was arrested, accused of adultery and high treason, a death sentence in all but name. Jane, too, was seized. Her mind began to fracture under the weight of terror and guilt. In her cell, witnesses described her as distracted and mentally deranged, haunted by visions, unable to eat or sleep, consumed by remorse or madness. Traditionally, English law forbade the execution of the insane, but Henry's rage was absolute. Parliament, obedient and cold, passed a law specifically to allow the execution of those deemed mentally unfit if they were found guilty of treason. It was a legal dagger forged for Jane alone, a grim gift from a king who would not be denied his revenge. There would be no mercy, no sanctuary in madness, only the axe. On a freezing February morning in 1542, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was led to the scaffold alongside Katherine Howard. The girl queen was barely out of childhood, trembling but resolute. Jane, once so adept at navigating courtly peril, now stumbled, broken by fear, her mind lost to the tide of events she had helped unleash. Some say she confessed her part, others that she was beyond words. The executioner waited, sword sharp, audience silent. The final moments were swift. Katherine knelt, prayed, and died. Jane followed, her body yielding at last to the will of a king who made new laws simply to erase her. Blood darkened the straw, the crowd shuddered, and another warning was written in the history of Tudor England. Loyalty was never enough. The court remembered Jane not as a villain, but as a casualty, proof that in the world of Henry VIII, even those who served, survived, or repented could not escape the reach of royal paranoia. Jane Boleyn's story is one of survival, guilt, and the price of being too close to power. She was neither monster nor martyr, simply a woman who did what she could to survive in a world that demanded everything and forgave nothing. Her legacy is not only her testimony, but her fate. A law changed to enable her death, a warning to all who might serve too faithfully, love too dangerously, or know too much. Her spirit lingers in the silent corners of palaces, a reminder that history's darkest stories are not always written by villains, but by those who were simply too visible when the world turned cruel. In the end, Lady Rochford became a lesson for every generation. Power protects no one, and those who survive its storms often pay in madness, isolation, or erasure. Her life was the sum of her choices, her loyalties, and her fears. Her death, by law written just for her, echoes as proof that in the world of kings and queens, a woman's mind, her loyalty, even her sanity could be claimed, judged, and destroyed at the stroke of a royal pen. Women were burned as witches for herbal medicine. They were called wise women, healers, midwives, the keepers of secrets, of roots and leaves, the ones you went to when the doctor was too far or the priest's prayers did not work. For centuries, these women lived on the edge of villages, trusted and feared in equal measure. They knew how to coax life from earth, how to ease the pain of childbirth, how to draw fevers out of shivering bodies with teas and tonics passed down through generations. But in the shadows of history, their wisdom became dangerous. In a world ruled by fear and superstition, every healing was a miracle until it failed. And when it failed, someone had to pay. Imagine the dusk settling over a thatched cottage, a mother's cry, a sick child, a desperate hope. The herbalist bends over her mortar, crushing dried leaves, whispering charms, half for comfort, half for protection. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the child lives, the fever breaks, and the villagers murmur their thanks. But sometimes the illness wins. Crops wither, rain doesn't fall, babies die, and the villagers look for someone to blame. The church says evil must have a face. So they turn on the woman with the garden of herbs, the woman who knows too much. It didn't take much. A rumor, a quarrel, a cow that refused to give milk. The accusations swelled like a storm. Old grudges became evidence. A glance became a curse. They said she flew at night, danced with the devil, cursed the harvest. In truth, most accused women were simply stubborn, outspoken, or unfortunate. But fear is contagious, and nothing spreads faster than suspicion. The witch hunts fed on panic, turning neighbors into informants and friends into accusers. Trials were held in cold stone halls, sometimes nothing more than public spectacles. The accused was stripped of dignity and hope. She might be pricked with needles to find a witch's mark, forced to recite impossible prayers, or thrown into rivers. If she floated, she was guilty. If she drowned, she was innocent, but dead. Logic collapsed under the weight of collective terror. Women confessed to impossible crimes just to end the torment. Some hoped for mercy. Few found it. Those found guilty faced the flames. The executioner's torch was not just punishment. It was erasure. Fire meant their stories, their knowledge, even their names were turned to ash. Their families were left with nothing but fear and shame, their villages emptier, the world a little colder for each life destroyed. Why did it happen? At its heart, the witch hunts were a war on women's wisdom. Herbal medicine threatened the authority of doctors and priests, who saw healing as their exclusive domain. The church demanded faith, not remedies brewed in secret. Any woman who defied the natural order, who held power outside the reach of men, was suspect. And so the fires burned, not just in England or Salem, but across Europe for centuries, tens of thousands consumed by smoke and hysteria. Yet the memory of those women endures. In every recipe for elderflower syrup, every whispered remedy for a fever, their resistance survives. Their deaths are a warning of what happens when fear rules reason and power fears knowledge. But they are also a testament that even in the face of terror, there were women who stood by their craft, who risked everything to heal, and whose courage echoes long after the last fire died. Their legacy is more than tragedy. It's a reminder that knowledge, no matter how dangerous it seems, can never be fully destroyed. The story of the witches is not just about persecution. It's about survival. The world tried to burn their wisdom, but the seeds they planted in secret gardens have outlasted every pyre. In every corner of history where a woman dared to heal, she left behind a spark, small, hidden, but impossible to extinguish. Eleanor Cobham was publicly humiliated and imprisoned. In the heart of medieval England, in a time when power was balanced on a knife's edge and rumors could destroy a dynasty, one woman's rise and fall echoed with the terror of the age. Her name was Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess of Gloucester, a woman whose ambition and fate collided in a spectacle of public shame and secret revenge. Eleanor was not born to royalty, but she climbed the ranks with a blend of charm, intelligence, and calculated alliance. She began her life as the daughter of a minor noble, serving as a lady-in-waiting at the glittering court of King Henry VI. In the shadows of palace corridors, Eleanor became entangled with Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, uncle to the king, heir presumptive, and one of the most powerful men in England. Their love affair caused a scandal, but in this world the line between love and politics was thin, and ambition was a language spoken fluently by both men and women. Humphrey eventually made Eleanor his wife, transforming her from a courtly companion to Duchess of Gloucester. The couple's marriage brought Eleanor unprecedented influence. She became known for her beauty, her wit, and her sway over the Duke. Some whispered that she was more than just a duchess, that she was the real power behind Gloucester's ambitions. In the fragile, dangerous world of the royal court, such whispers were rarely innocent. But England was restless. The court was a maze of conspiracies, factions, and jealousies. Humphrey's enemies, rival nobles, cunning clerics, and those coveting the throne, waited for any sign of weakness. And Eleanor, brilliant and proud, made a perfect target. In 1441, a scandal broke that would shatter her world forever. Accusations emerged that Eleanor, desperate to secure her husband's hold on power, had turned to forbidden arts, necromancy, sorcery, the dark magic of prophecy. The charges were as theatrical as they were terrifying. Eleanor was accused of conspiring with astrologers and soothsayers to predict the king's death and to craft potions or charms meant to manipulate fate. Her supposed co-conspirators were arrested, tortured, and pressed to confess. Under pain and fear, they implicated Eleanor, some surely to save themselves, others perhaps coerced by those who hungered for her ruin. In medieval England, where superstition and politics danced a deadly waltz, to be accused of witchcraft was often a sentence in itself. The punishment that awaited her was designed to break not just her body, but her spirit. Eleanor Cobham was dragged from her residence, stripped of her dignity, and forced to walk barefoot through the crowded, hostile streets of London. On 3 separate days she was paraded, holding a taper in her hand, her head bowed low, surrounded by jeering crowds who had once admired her beauty and grace. This public penance was as much a warning as a punishment, a lesson to every woman who might dare to reach too high and every noble who might plot against the throne. The humiliation did not end with the parades. Eleanor, already broken by loss and disgrace, was condemned to life imprisonment. She was moved from fortress to fortress, first Leeds Castle in Kent, then Pevensey Castle, and finally Beaumaris Castle in distant Wales. The cold stones of her prison became her only companions, her name now spoken with pity, contempt, or fear. Years passed in isolation, her former life of courtly splendor replaced by silence and shadows. Behind the official charges lay darker truths. Eleanor's downfall was not merely a question of alleged witchcraft. It was the result of deadly political envy. Her husband, the Duke of Gloucester, stood as the last great obstacle to the ambitions of his rivals, including Cardinal Beaufort and William de la Pole. By destroying Eleanor, they struck at Gloucester himself, weakening his claim and isolating him from the throne. Not long after Eleanor's disgrace, Gloucester too would be arrested and die under mysterious circumstances, a fate many believe was orchestrated by his enemies at court. Eleanor Cobham's story is not just a tale of sorcery and scandal, but a window into the deep insecurities of a kingdom teetering on the edge. In an era where prophecies were feared as much as swords, and where a woman's influence could make her a threat to kings, the fate of the Duchess of Gloucester was sealed the moment she stepped into the light of power. Her ambitions, her love, and her alliances marked her for destruction in a world where those closest to the crown risked losing everything in the blink of an eye. Yet her legacy lingers in the haunted corners of English history, a stark reminder of how easily a life can be shattered by rumor, jealousy, and the ruthless machinery of political survival. The spectacle of her penance, the proud Duchess barefoot, humbled before the world, remains one of the most chilling images of the medieval era. It is a vision of how public humiliation could be weaponized by those who ruled, and how fear itself was a tool sharper than any blade. Eleanor spent her final years in captivity, her name erased from the court she once dazzled. She died in 1452, alone behind stone walls, the echo of her former power drowned out by the tides of history. But in every account of her fall, we see not just the tragedy of a single woman, but the price paid by those who dared to rise in a world ruled by suspicion and greed. The streets of London that once witnessed her public shame have long since changed. But the lesson of Eleanor Cobham survives. In an age of paranoia, when superstition was law and envy was lethal, to be powerful was to be vulnerable. To be close to the throne was to dance on the edge of disaster. And sometimes the most dangerous thing of all was to be seen. Alice Driver laughed while being burned alive. In the final frantic days of Mary Tudor's reign, an era soaked in the terror of religious violence, one woman's laughter became a weapon sharper than any sword. Alice Driver was no noble, no high-born rebel, but a simple farmer's daughter from the flat, wind-battered lands of Suffolk. She had no armies, no powerful family to defend her, and no fortune to bribe her captors. What she did have was a faith that could not be broken and a courage that stunned even her killers. Her death would not simply be an ending, but a spark, a defiant, unforgettable moment in the darkest hours of England's war over the soul of its people. The England into which Alice was born was a land racked by violent change. Only a few years before her arrest, King Henry VIII had ripped the Church from Rome and set the nation adrift in a storm of reform, rebellion, and betrayal. The pendulum of faith swung wildly. Edward VI, Henry's son, pushed the country further into Protestantism, and for a brief moment, England seemed destined for a new, radical future. But in 1553, the death of the boy king brought Mary Tudor, daughter of Katherine of Aragon, fierce Catholic, and the first woman to claim the English throne in her own right. For her, restoring the old faith was both a holy mission and a bloody necessity. The countryside trembled as Mary's government hunted anyone suspected of heresy. Those who refused to recant their Protestant beliefs faced the full machinery of state terror, interrogation, prison, and for hundreds, the stake. But it was in this climate of fear that figures like Alice Driver emerged. Ordinary people who refused to be cowed, whose very defiance became a challenge to the regime's authority. For Alice, the new religion was not just politics, it was truth itself, worth more than her own life. Arrested in 1558 for spreading Protestant ideas, Alice was dragged from her home, her hands tied, and paraded before local magistrates. The interrogations were brutal, meant to break her will and force her to denounce her faith. But Alice was not easily frightened. She answered her accusers with wit and fire, ridiculing their threats and poking fun at their hypocrisy. Even when she was tortured and threatened with the flames, she stood firm. The stories say she laughed in their faces, mocking the rituals and condemning the cruelty of a church that would kill to prove its point. On the day of her execution, Alice was led through the jeering crowds to the stake at Thetford. The authorities expected fear, tears, and desperate pleas for mercy, anything that would remind the watching crowd that the state still ruled by terror. But Alice gave them none of it. As the chains tightened around her body and the wood was piled at her feet, she smiled. When her accusers read out her sentence, she interrupted with sharp retorts, ridiculing their words. Witnesses described her laughter, loud, almost reckless, echoing over the murmurs of the crowd. To the very end, she refused to let her captors see her suffer. As the flames rose, Alice did not weep or scream. Instead, she called out to the crowd, urging them not to fear those who could kill the body but could not touch the soul. She shouted that her suffering was not defeat, but proof of her cause. And as the fire consumed her, she laughed, a sound so shocking, so defiant, that even hardened soldiers flinched. Her smile, her laughter, became a final act of rebellion, proof that fear could be defeated, even in the heart of the flames. Alice Driver's death was not forgotten. In a time when hundreds perished in silence, her mockery and composure turned martyrdom into resistance. News of her courage spread rapidly, whispered from village to village, written into secret pamphlets, remembered in Protestant sermons for generations. For those who heard her story, Alice became a symbol that power can kill the body, but cannot command the soul. Her burning did not destroy her ideas. It made them immortal, lighting the way for those who would come after and haunting the regime that had tried to silence her. Mary Tudor's reign would soon end, swept away by Elizabeth's ascent and the new Protestant order. The old faith's fire faded, but the memory of those who stood in its path, laughing, unbroken, remained. Alice Driver's story lingers not as a tale of suffering, but of unimaginable courage, of a spirit that turned the stake into a stage for resistance. Even centuries later, her laughter rings out across the gulf of time, a reminder that sometimes the greatest power is the refusal to be afraid. The Maid of Norway's death changed every woman's fate. Picture the cold gray waters of the North Sea, a ship tossed by the wind, and aboard it, a fragile thread upon which the fate of a nation and the lives of generations of women was about to snap. The year is 1290. The Maid of Norway, a child queen, barely 8 years old, is making the treacherous journey from her homeland toward Scotland, where she is expected to claim the throne left vacant by her grandfather, King Alexander III. She carries with her not just a royal title, but the hope of stability for an entire kingdom. But fate has no mercy for innocence, and in her death a chain reaction begins, a reaction that will reverberate for centuries, shaping the destiny of every noblewoman who would ever dream of power. The Maid of Norway, her real name was Margaret, was not raised to rule. She was the daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland, the granddaughter of a king whose sudden death in a riding accident had plunged Scotland into uncertainty. The Scottish lords, terrified of an empty throne and the chaos that might follow, clung to the little girl across the sea as their last desperate hope. Every eye was on her. Every rival claimant sharpened their knives in the shadows. When news came that the Maid was on her way to Scotland, the nation held its breath. Her safe arrival would mean peace. Her loss would mean something far darker. But the voyage was doomed. Somewhere along the storm-battered Orkney coast, the Maid of Norway died. Some say of illness, others whisper of poison. But the truth is lost to time. What is certain is that her body never reached Scottish soil, and the country was left leaderless, vulnerable, and afraid. In that single moment, the carefully balanced web of alliances, marriages, and dynastic claims unraveled. The vacuum she left behind drew in ambitious men and foreign powers, and unleashed a succession crisis so severe it would set the stage for war, occupation, and the rise and fall of families for centuries to come. But beneath the political disaster, something quieter but even more profound began to change. The shock of the Maid's death transformed the way royal bloodlines were guarded and controlled. Suddenly, the succession of a woman, a queen regnant, a princess, a potential mother of future kings, became not just a hope, but a risk. The great lords and kings of Europe, watching the chaos in Scotland, grew ever more fearful of placing their fates in the hands of young girls who could be lost to disease, abduction, or political intrigue. Marriages became weapons. Noble women became chess pieces, used to secure alliances, to bear heirs, but never to truly rule. In the years that followed, Scotland was torn apart by civil war and foreign intervention. The so-called Great Cause, the competition for the Scottish crown, brought English armies north and put Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, at the center of the storm. But while armies clashed and kingdoms crumbled, the unwritten rules of inheritance hardened into iron law. Women's claims to thrones were written with conditions, limits, and loopholes, ensuring that their power would always be borrowed, never owned. Every daughter born to a royal house was now seen through the lens of risk, her marriage a political calculation, her womb a battlefield. For noble women, this meant lives of constant scrutiny, suspicion, and control. Their choices were no longer their own. Each birth, miscarriage, or childhood illness became a national crisis. Each marriage proposal carried the shadow of a possible civil war. The fear of another Maid of Norway, a single fragile heiress whose death could topple dynasties, hung over every court in Europe. The very idea of a female ruler became something to fear, to hedge against, to bury beneath layers of regency, guardianship, and manipulation. And so the fate of one small girl shifted the fate of all women of her class. What began as a tragedy at sea became the blueprint for centuries of oppression. Queens and princesses would live and die within cages of protocol and suspicion. Their value measured not by their minds or courage, but by their ability to survive, to produce sons, and to avoid the fate that had drowned the hopes of Scotland in 1290. Even in the later centuries, when women did reach thrones, Elizabeth I, Mary, Queen of Scots, Katherine de' Medici, the shadow of the Maid of Norway haunted them. Every step they took was measured against the fear of instability their rule could unleash. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, left behind no grave that inspired pilgrimage, no great acts of statecraft or war. Yet her ghost was everywhere, haunting the corridors of power, whispering caution into the ears of kings, and teaching the architects of royal succession that the lives of women, no matter how royal, were forever to be controlled, managed, and, when necessary, sacrificed for the illusion of stability. Her death was not just a tragedy for a child who never had the chance to rule. It was a turning point that taught the men of power to guard their thrones not with wisdom, but with fear. The ripples of that loss shaped every royal marriage contract, every law of succession, every whispered warning to young princesses about the dangers of being too visible, too vulnerable, too important. The Maid of Norway's passing changed history, not just for Scotland, but for all the women who would inherit her burden, a silent legacy written not in crowns, but in chains.